As a principal with Agree Dispute Resolution, Gary Furlong works with parties to more effectively negotiate at the bargaining table. Canadian Labour reporter sat down with Gary to hear about what he has to say about what's really going on during negotiations and how things can be improved. You talk about how trust between parties at a bargaining table is influenced by predictable hidden assumptions. What does that mean?
It turns out that there are actually, in the way that the human brain and the human mind operate, there are some very fundamental built-in biases and processes that affect the we that makes those decisions. And it is a we, meaning inside each of our heads there's sort of, one way to think of it is more than one entity that is negotiating or contributing to what we think are the decisions that we make. But it stays hidden. It's not something we consciously pay attention to. So many times when we think we're behaving quite rationally, that's a judgment that's made by a competing set of processes in our head that may later on reflection, we'd say, why the heck did I do that? Or how did that make sense when I did that back then? And suddenly, later on, we can't quite understand why it seemed so good at the time. You know, that phrase, I guess you had to be there. Well, there was a process or a context going on that we were responding to that was unconscious to us, but seemed to make sense at the time. So what I'm talking about is how to understand and uncover some of those biases, some of those traps, some of those principles of how the mind and the brain work so that we can be far more effective when we're at the table.
You train parties about the rule of reciprocity in bargaining. What does that mean?
So we've all heard about the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. What we don't understand is that human beings are hardwired to reciprocate, to give back what they are given. So this one's interesting because every human society on the planet that has been studied subscribes to this rule. And the rule basically says that you have an obligation to give, you have an obligation to receive when given, and most importantly, you have an obligation to repay. Well, in bargaining, for example, we've developed a whole system of what we call at the table horse trading. In other words, I have to get something back when I give something. More importantly, if I'm willing to accept something, I know you're going to ask for something and I have to figure out something to give you. So what does that do at the table? Well, it then says, I know I've got a horse trade, so both parties show up at the table with what we call extreme positions. They know I got to give and give, so I start off more extreme, which of course has the impact when both parties show up with extreme positions of breaking trust right at the beginning. The second thing it does is both parties come to the table with what we call fluff items. They pad it because they know they got to give stuff. So now instead of coming to the table with 8 or 10 items, I come with 30. And so do you, by the way. And then we waste all this time at the table trying to trade fluff items that we both know are really kind of BS, but we got to go through that dance because we're unconsciously driven by this idea of reciprocity.
So how can one side of the bargaining table change the tone of negotiations?
So I can go to the table right off the bat and say, listen, here's how we're approaching it. You can choose to do what you want. I'm not going to trade items with you. I will give every item you bring respect and I'll listen to it, but I'm not trading items. If your item has merit, I'll help solve the problem. And by the way, I'm going to look for you as a responsible negotiator to do the same for me. Secondly, I'm not bringing any fluff. So any item I bring, I need your help with and I need us to work on. And I'm only bringing X number, and the fact that if you give me something because it makes sense, I'm not going to be looking to give you something back, because I'm going to treat your items with the same level of interest and respect.